Yeah, I have to protest. I fundamentally disagree with you, all of you two, about economic matters. Now I want to rewind this clock, the M2 money supply clock back to the beginning and the first quarter of 2017. What we know is that when this started, the velocity of money was right around 1.991, and now it's, the latest measurements have it at 1.406. And this chart, were it not, were the colors actually right on this, I can't believe they're as white as they are. If I wish I could mess with the colors, but I mean, the indicator now is, you see this, the trend, like the bottom of it, the lowest point was in 2002, and now it's ticking back up. 2022, sorry. The bottom of this was way back in this range. Right to 2021 and everything, and now ever since it's been kind of going back up. But that looks more like a dead cat bounce than a severe, a sincere recovery of the velocity of things. And what gets me and everything is that inflation rate 2025 quarter three. What we're seeing. And as far as the quarter three inflation rate, and I know that this just this doesn't include like grocery prices and everything, but we can also get some measures of that. People are going out and getting those figures, but the current inflation rate, is right now the current one is hovering around 3% annually, which what kills me about that is that with frustration about that is that my analysis here has been the same the whole time. So we need to go look at what happened when the Fed intervened, you know, and everything to the money supply, you know, and manipulate the chart so that you can see this and everything, right? So let's take our observations not that far back, but 2001, 001. Now, one thing that I wanted to tell you is that housing prices collapsed, the government intervened, and housing prices went back up. You know, so when this started, what we see is that you had you had the money supply was at 7,118.3, and now, today it's at, you know, a whopping, more than doubling that happened at 22,000, 322, sorry, 0.4. Now, we can take that figure, and look what happens when we divide it by the old one and everything in terms of things, and divide, by. And what we see is that the Fed's interventions that happened represented a more than tripling, of the M2 money supply. And, that means, and what that number translates to is actually, 300 and 313% higher, you know, so that's a more than tripling in the money supply that's transpired. Now, have we seen inflation? Can I need to ask you a fundamental critical thinking question. Have we seen an inflation rate of 313% in the price of goods and services? Now, I happen to know that an Austrian economist is going to redefine inflation as an increase in the money supply, but that wacky definition is not one that I actually consent to. I dissent from it, and I will not accept it. I find it an unacceptable definition of inflation. I would like to define inflation as a rise in the price of goods and services. Now, if I go and look at what we're seeing in terms of inflation this year, I see it's been a modest 3%. I've seen some figures, that prices were rising by about 8% for a while, and now they're back down to 3. So with realities like that, with the money supply expanded by 300%, 313%, basically, and on the flip end of that, prices didn't rise anything like, they didn't more than triple, and even in the energy sector, and on you know uh, gasoline, and yet the Fed interventions were used as a pretext to advocate that everybody go out and make a run on gold, silver, and Bitcoin. It was like, this is what they told everybody to buy. It's what the advice was. It was, let's have a run on silver and gold and Bitcoin and into those, currencies. And yet, have we seen hyperinflation even in this COVID situation? No, the fundamental analysis hasn't changed. In fact, the money, the velocity of money is in a bit of a dead cat bounce. It's not really, it really hasn't really recovered since 2007. It hasn't come back on, and despite the fact that the Fed more than tripled the M2 money supply, we have not seen prices for goods and services more than triple their price, and what they were way back in 2007. That just has not happened. So you've had a big fundamental failing of the quantity theory of money here, because what we're seeing is a situation where the money supply was raised by 313%, and yet goods and the price of goods and services didn't rise by 313%. They rose, maybe 3%, and with some anomalous years that were like 8%. That it just, even if you add all those years up, they don't cumulatively add up to that much. So inflation has not been in proportion to the rise in the M2 money supply. It's been out of whack with it. And this has been an ongoing reality. Prices for goods and services have not risen in proportion to the rises in the M2 money supply. That just has not happened. And so, it begs a lot of questions, and it makes you wonder, why that is the case. Why is the velocity of money collapsing the way that it is? Why did it collapse in the first place? And it's because people started saving. They didn't just start saving either. They started buying assets. They would go and buy bonds, and they would buy, stock. What they didn't do is take that money and spend it into the economy. The thing about poor people is that they have a greater marginal propensity to consume, which means they spend a greater total of their money, actually consuming. But these people that we're talking about, the bondholders on the other side of the U.S., the fact that the government is going out of its way to spend, the counterparties on that are bondholders, and bondholders are investors, and investors don't act like most consumers in the economy. When they get paid, they don't go out and go on a shopping spree. Their marginal propensity to consume does not go up. They just buy more bonds and stock and assets. They don't go on a spending spree. And so this whole hyperinflationary panic mongering crowd that is gathered here on YouTube has some very fundamental holes in the analysis that they've been promulgating here on the platform for a very long time. There is a massive problem with your thesis.